So thanks to David and Achille for the invitation, and I'm very conscious of both the privilege to join what looks like a kind of fantastic occasion, and if you like, the double bind of joining in the conversation partway through. There's always, I guess, a tension between travelling theory and parachuting scholarship, and Raj Patel, who writes about Durban, has written a very powerful piece actually about the forms of contemporary exclusion in the shack-dwelling communities of Kennedy Road, very close to where we are right now, I guess, and with some fairly damning remarks about scholars that come and go on the circuit. In the spirit, though, of a kind of critical inquiry that is more engaged and takes the places we start from as frames. I suppose I want to just say a word or two about a talk that I hope addresses some of the themes that are relevant to you, but is obviously coming from my own interests. So if I try and draw those things together slightly, they come from a sense of dissatisfaction, I guess, with some of the debates around race and class that we've seen in various parts of not only the global north, but also the global south in recent years. A sense of a bifurcation of an understanding of what is happening in the cities of the global south and the global north simultaneously. There is almost a kind of a way in which the cities of the global north, which became paradigmatic forms of explaining the world, was critiqued by a very exciting scholarship from the cities of the global south. But almost these worlds have begun to kind of part one from another. And I suppose what I would try and say is it's not just that the empire strikes back, but it's also the fact that other things, other forms of cultural traffic move globally. You can't understand what is happening in East London right now unless you understand what is happening in contemporary Bangladesh. You can't understand what is happening around processes of informalization and the creativity of forms of informality without understanding simultaneously, I think, how processes on the street work in the cities of the north and the south, and the technologies through which these worlds become visible or are made invisible is likewise something that I think works at an intercontinental scale rather than merely the local. That is not to underprivilege the local, which I'll come back to in just a second. And I guess the final context I want to say a little bit about is one in which we tell our stories in ways that assume easy heroes and villains. These Manichaean stories tend to need an easy post against which to hit, and the neoliberal in particular seems to me a fairly easy target in some of this discussion. And I think part of what I wanted to do today, a significant part of what I wanted to do today, is to kind of pull that apart a little bit, to interrogate this easy target. And the reason is that when I look at debates, when I arrived in Cape Town a couple of days ago, what we saw on the front pages of the papers was a massive debate about who land rights belong to, who could claim, who could reclaim land. If you go to the District 6 Museum, which I think you folk are going to in a few days' time, part of that debate is about who is displaced and who reclaims and who belongs. And that is part of the legacy of the apartheid years, but it's also part of the legacy that tries to move, I guess, from the racial, out of the frames of the racial to something that might be somewhere beyond that. But the register of voice that we use to speak to those pasts, how we think about, if you like, the nightmares of the past and the horizons of the future simultaneously, I think begs certain questions about the language of politics and the language of economy that we bring together. That's a kind of general introduction to what I want to kind of say a little bit more about in the paper, which I'll read from occasionally and talk to. But the paper actually begins anecdotally in that spirit, I guess, of thinking about those tensions between political economy and political theory, where actually 20 years ago, I was at a conference to celebrate the work of David Harvey, an eminent scholar, and Ara Katznelson stood up, another scholar who's written on Marxism in the city, a gentleman of a certain age, but whose scholarship I think we should respect in all sorts of ways. But Katznelson said to Harvey, I think you should engage more with political theory in your work, in understanding what is happening in the city. Harvey having given one of his very pungent, trenchant defences of a class analysis of urban change. And there was a fairly kind of robust exchange between the two of them before Katznelson turned to Harvey and said, well, to be honest, David, I think we've reached a certain point where you remind me of the Jewish shipwreck survivor. The person who, when they arrive to rescue him from the island, they find no one on the island at all, but on the island they also find 2 synagogues. And when they ask him, why do you have 2 synagogues on your island? The survivor says, well, that's the synagogue that I don't go to. And in one of the Katznelson says, well, political theory is the synagogue you don't go to. And I suppose what I want to kind of tease out a little bit is where the tensions between political economy and political theory begin to bite. I was very struck when I did some very short work in South Africa a long time ago, in the immediate years after apartheid, which was trying to do some work on what local governance might look like in post-apartheid years, about how the suspicion of the state was built into the emergent new constitution. The civics become formally recognized as a kind of agency that is, if you like, qualifying state power. That suspicion of the state that gives civil society a particular role makes a suspicion of the state at the heart of that new world. It's a suspicion that in some ways, we shouldn't forget, is actually echoed in another moment, which is particularly significant for the 20th century, which was the reconstruction of Western Europe in the wake of the 39-45 World War, where in Austria in particular, but in Austria and Germany, the new forms of economic thought that in Foucault's lectures is described as the kind of growth of the ordo-liberal movement are struck by a suspicion of state power and a need to think about the architecture of new markets that might be constructed in ways in which the potential for state power to do bad might be constrained. And well, I don't want to spend too long on it today. The line of history that takes us from the ordo-liberals of Europe through to the Chicago Boys and their consequences over the last 3 or 4 decades makes us think, I think, about where neoliberalism comes from. As I say, part of what I'd want to almost characterize today's discussion as being, in a way, is a slight sense, if you know Clifford Geertz's fantastic essay, Anti-Essentialism, that it may be almost time to think a little bit about what we might describe as an anti-neoliberalism. Not that the neoliberal is, in any sense, to be rescued at all, but that in order to understand the beast, we need to complicate its genealogy and its operation, to actually begin to think slightly more in a more sophisticated fashion about the values that are at its heart, but also the genealogy of its thinking. And in particular, I guess, what that means is thinking slightly more carefully about the balance between a register of citizenship and appeals to the rights to the city, which have now become almost commonplace in the cities of the global south and the global north alike, and the limits to those sorts of claims that depend upon a register of citizenship. I'll just read a little bit to try and outline the argument a bit. We can see today increasingly a politics of the right to the city in Cairo or Bangkok, Caracas or Kiev, that lacks a Manichaean narrative of heroes and villains. The challenges of new forms of urban democracy and urban regimes in the global north and the global south alike cannot be ignorant of this global context. Today's urban movement speaks to a normative notion of how we think about the right to the city in an age of austerity. The paper, the talk, argues that a normative political agenda must take at its heart the ethics of the unknowable city. Such an ethics privileges what we do not know over what is familiar and known. It foregrounds the obligations both to the strangers of the present day and the generations of the future in the city that is yet to come. It recognises the constitutive tensions between institutions of governance and emergent configurations of the social. But such a stance inevitably qualifies some of the more celebratory accounts of the potential of participatory democracy, whether it's in Porto Alegre or in South Africa itself. The value of the symbolic spectacles of the city occupied, and the propensity of Aristotelian appeals to virtue over the messy compromises and deal-making of the deliberative moment. If this involves taking a slightly more nuanced approach to the populist movements of the contemporary metropolis, it also demands a more systemic exposure of normative agendas that involve incommensurable and difficult trade-offs in an agonistic politics that are sometimes either erased in a literature of analytical political science or taken for granted in appeals to a progressive urbanism. In this argument, we start from a position that pragmatically a central tenet of Henri Lefebvre that was empirical as much as political. That if urbanisation is not only the realisation but also the driver of social and economic form, then the city becomes empirically the site of the increasing accumulation of people, the demos of the social as well as a political project in its own right. If empirically the city grows, and in the 21st century we are witnessing a global growth of urban concentrations unparalleled, I'm just going to drop that one in there. Then we need to consider how urban space accommodates new populations. And so ethically the city belongs not only to those that live there, but also to those that have yet to arrive. Those that have yet to come are most obviously migrants. But the point I want to try and make is that we need to return to a sense of arrival, to interrogate the notion of arrival in a little bit more detail. The city belongs not only to those that live there, but also to those that have yet to arrive. Those that have yet to come involve most obviously migrants, new arrivals whose energy and whose labour is the lifeblood of the metropolis. But it also speaks to those generations who have not yet inherited the present. And in a slightly different frame, I would argue that this notion of arrival also speaks to those dislocated by the turbulence of economic restructuring. There is a sense in which we are all arriving in the city of the present, and so the challenge to dwell in the modern metropolis can be similarly disorientating for both the newly arrived migrant and the person that finds themselves suddenly economically surplus alike. The power, the turbocharged changes that we see in economies across the north and south, I think makes us think again about, if you go right the way back to Zimmel's claim that it's arrival that disorientates, and the attempt to overcome the challenges of arrival that create a frame of rationality through a form of editing of the sensorium of the city. And the point, the kind of disturbance, the impossibility of dwelling in some ways, is something that I think we need to think of in terms of its temporalities as well as in terms of its forms of geographical mobility. There's a sense, as I say, in which we are all always arriving in the present, when the present is always slipping beneath our fingers so fast. There's a long-standing precedent for such thinking. The Athenians believed that the moral imperative was to leave the city a better place on departure than arrival. The sense that there is a moral obligation to what comes next, to those who inherit the present, famously informs Aristotle's description of the constitution of ancient Athens, and is central to the genesis of the political imaginary of the metropolis as the good city. It prefigures a notion of intergenerational ethics and foregrounds a sense of obligation as much as rights for both the new arrival and the citizen. But it sits uneasily with the ways in which the urban age of the 21st century has treated the steady flow of people to the city, movements from rural to urban and across national boundaries alike. And if we look through the lens of arrival, the global flows of people and cultures, the movement from rural dispersal to urban concentration, the political geometry of the right to the city demands that we supplement the politics of the production of space with an ethics of the production of temporalities. If progressive urbanism has thought systematically about the former, it considers the latter less often, and the synthesis of both productions, space and time, less frequently still. The talk tries to argue that such a synthesis of urban temporalities and spatialities, geographies of the future as well as histories of the present, has consequences for how we think through the right to the 21st century city. In Durban as much as London, in Los Angeles as much as Rio. The argument is advanced in 4 steps, and I'm going to read these out and then try and talk to most of the rest of the paper in general terms through the slides. So there are 4 steps to the argument. The first involves a diagnostic nuancing of how we come to understand the politics of austerity in the context of the history of neoliberalism. It looks to recent scholarship that focuses on the production of the histories of neoliberal thought, and here I'm thinking of the work of particularly scholars like Emma Rothschild, Phil Moravsky, Daniel Stedman Jones, Nicholas Gain, Will Davis, all of whom I think have tried to reinscribe the histories of the neoliberal in ways that are more nuanced and also reveal, curious connections. If you think of the growth of phenomenological sociology in the 1960s, scholars like Berger and Luckmann and their traces back to parts of Austrian debates, that we need to think about where the neoliberal moment comes from, I think. It argues for a serious foregrounding of the neoliberal as a regime of economic governance that has rested on the prominence of certain logics of neoclassical economics, and in particular the manner in which the law and economics movement, associated with Nobel Prize winner Ronald Coase, argued that externalities could be priced and regulated through the market rather than mediated by state intervention. This had profound consequences for the relationship between people and property. The facility to inhabit spaces and access their resources, foregrounded by some of the themes around race and class so germane to the travelling event that we're all part of today. Property rights need to be foregrounded alongside other rights that we invoke in Lefebvrean urbanisms. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that the claims on the right to the city need to think seriously about the regimes of power through which rights are organised, particularly around the fundamental notions of property. The second step is to suggest that the institution of property rights is both historically contingent and plural in its propensity to shape the relationship of people and things in the metropolis. Historically, the crises of the 18th and 19th century capitalism in the global north generated debates about property and the productivity of landholding that played out in various colonial configurations of property rights that reframed the right to the city in sites as diverse as India, Hong Kong, Singapore, where effectively what you see is that the traumas of 19th century English capitalism played out in experiments to try and regulate the growth of metropolitan form in colonial settlements. These reconfigurations created alternative possibilities for how we come to think about the propensity of the city to accommodate and to allow citizens of the city to access resources. They depend on both the institutional configurations of property rights and the cultural construction of regimes of governance and governmentality. The third step is to suggest that these institutional configurations define the structure of markets. We know that the architecture of markets is contingent, and interest in their design is an essential corrective to a juxtaposition and separation of state power, revealed market preference, and civil society. The institutional forms of markets and states and the associational propensities of civil society are mutually implicated and historically contingent. The relations between them are transactional. And the fourth step we need is the argument is to suggest that we need to treat with some degree of caution new forms of urban political participation that privilege the social movements of the city. Forms of political agonism and policy trade-offs highlight a more complex urban present and some of the choices that might inform the shaping of the future metropolis. A synthesis of the production of space with the production of time in the generation of political horizons might leave us more ambivalent about city futures, but also aware of the paradoxical propensity of the city as a utopian possibility and dystopian imaginary. In a sense, what I'm trying to argue is against an easy radical reading of the ways in which configurations of race and class play out in the contemporary metropolis. There's a piece that Peter Marcuse, again a scholar whose work I respect, he juxtaposes if you like, the heroic discussions of the World Social Forum, which produce analyses of real dystopias, with the conversations at the World Urban Forum Habitat, UN, World Bank funded World Urban Forum, where we discuss good practice. The implication being that the one is heroic and progressive and the other is less so. I want to try and suggest it's a little bit more complicated than that. Not least, and again I'll just try and talk through the themes of the paper in the time that I've got available to me and try and relate it back to some of the discussions of the travelling bus more generally, where we know that the sense of arrival is always one that is highly contested. I suppose the spirit of what I want to do is informed not by an attempt to speak about the legacies of apartheid, but speak in the spirit of, if those of you know Benjamin's Berlin Chronicles, where Benjamin says that he knows Berlin through 5 guides, and he has 5 not uncontentious guides. One is a nanny, one's a prostitute, but one of the guides is Paris. That Benjamin knows, he knows Berlin because he knows Paris. And in a sense, I think that what we need to look to is a kind of urbanism that speaks through a process not of comparative sociology, but through a mechanism of perspicuous contrast, something that thinks about the ways in which generic challenges are translated into specific local forms. And we know that part of this context is one in which the rise of anti-migrant sentiment can be found pretty much universally. Whether one looks at what happens at the arrival of Bihari migrants in Mumbai and the populist politics of Thackeray and others, and some of the other associated BJP formulations, the growth of fairly extreme forms of Islamophobia in Europe and intolerance of Islamic presence, or for that matter the examples of contemporary Hong Kong, where the arrival of migrants from the mainland to use the welfare resources of the hospitals of Hong Kong produced a characterization of migrants into Hong Kong as locusts. So the kind of the generic form of anti-migrant sentiment we know is pretty much universal. We know in a very straightforward form it is not entirely irrational, even in the economic calculus of the standard theorization. The fact is that the costs, the welfare externalities of migration tend to be realized at geographical scales of the neighborhood, whereas in economic theory and economic practice, the positive externalities of migration tend to be realized at the level of the labor market, different geographical scales. So analytically, we know that the basis of intolerance has a grain of reason traced in it. But we also know, I think, that in terms of thinking through the context of this, the first part of the argument that I kind of tried to outline earlier on, which again I'll jump through fairly quickly, is that when we're thinking about the ways in which the market makes sense of arrival in the city, we need the conventional framing of this problem has tended to be through the economics of the externality which very crudely was framed firstly or most famously by the British sociologist Arthur Pigou, who tried to argue that the overspill effects of unintended consequences needed to be mitigated through forms of state action. And I suppose in part what I want to try to suggest is that what it's important to think about is a little bit about how the neoliberal movement actually revolves around the attempt by Ronald Coase, born in Willesden, became one of the kind of founding movements of the founding fathers of the law and economics movement, who actually tried in particularly the very famous essay that he wrote, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1960, The Problem of Social Cost, to try and restructure the problem of externalities through trying to think about how the regulation of spillover effects of economic change could be priced instead of mediated through state action. Famously, one of the things that Coase did was that he actually, at Chicago, went to the law school and basically said that economics effectively displaces law. In the argument that he makes in the problems of social cost, he actually produces a fairly strong attack on the Pigouvian logic of externalities, and tries to argue that the market provides an alternative form of the regulation of externalities, and that what was effectively needed is not only a form of pricing of unintended consequences of economic action, but also a form of pricing that is dependent on a certain kind of clarity of property rights. And the simple argument, I'm going to jump through this fairly quickly because I want to kind of move on to things that may be more central to the gathering as a whole. But part of what the argument that Coase makes is that these forms of clarity, if you like, depend on two slightly different meanings of the term. There's a sense in which, on the one hand, what he's talking about is clarity as a notion of predictable rules, that in any set of circumstances, the game of economics can be played with a degree of certainty about what comes next. And if you look at the kind of the deep histories of the neoliberal, there's a sense in the work of the ordoliberals of Eastern Europe that this importance about the rules being constant is part of this story that comes out of the suspicion of state power, the suspicion of state prerogative. If you think about the ways in which if you like, the disenchantment with state action of the welfare states of the mid-20th century is based on the arbitrary nature of state power, the disenchantment with the ability to plan the welfare states of late 20th century Europe or the post-apartheid state of the 21st century comes partly out, I think, of a sense of disenchantment with the levers of social engineering, the levers of planning, of architecture, the attempt to design and create a rational city that is free of the, if you like, the stigmas of race and class. And that kind of clarity, Will Davis in his book, he talks about ordoliberalism prioritizes formalizing the rules of the competitive process. And in a very different fashion, what Chicago's law and economics prioritizes is formalizing private ownership of goods, including the ownership of spillover costs and benefits associated with those goods. The point is, the very simple point that I want to make in the paper more generally, is that what's at stake is not merely clarity of process, and this is where the point that Coase conflates, but also a plurality of rights that are at stake when we're talking about property rights. And for those of you that are kind of familiar with this, there's a sort of 101, property rights 101 to this, but when you look at the economist Harold Demsetz, who produces one of the kind of authoritative pieces on property rights, but is also an individual who, like Coase, is part of the Mont Pelerin Society, very closely associated with that lineage that comes through the law and economics movement, very closely associated with the kind of rise of a certain kind of theorizing in neoclassical economics. Well, the point that Demsetz makes is that what's at stake with property rights is not singular but plural. For Demsetz, who also argues in favor of these forms of clarity, there are 5 or 6 different ways in which we might think about the rights of property, the rights in terms of what's owned, who can own it, basically the ways in which you can decide what can be done with property, how property rules are maintained, but also how the fungibility of property, how exchange works. And the very simple point about Demsetz is that he begins to, on the one hand, argue for a clarification of property rights in line with Coase's argument. As I say, both of these strongly influenced by the Chicago school that begins to structure the forms of neoclassical economics that generate the Washington consensus in the in the late 1970s. But also when you go back to what Coase is saying in the kind of the original articles, and Demsetz is saying, that there's a very clear sense in which you begin to move away from this notion of clarity being about the limiting of state power to clarity being increasingly about the prerogatives of what you are allowed to do once you become the owner of property. And there's a comment that Demsetz makes in his famous piece in 1967 where he juxtaposes private property rights with communal property rights, suggesting that communal property means that future generations must speak for themselves. No one has yet estimated the costs of carrying out such a conversation. The simple point I want to make is that the temporalities of this kind of neoclassical economic thinking are the temporalities of a certain kind of cognitive frame. They're the temporalities that rule against an understanding of some of the things that I'm interested in thinking about in the context of the changing urbanisms of the global south and north, precisely because they privilege a rational calculus that generates a temporality of the deliberative moment of the right now. It also means that when we look at the reality on the ground, that property rights become much more complicated in their geographical expression. And in the paper, what I talk about is a series of examples that if you look at the ways in which British colonial rule works through both racial orders and property orders in India, in Hong Kong, in other parts of the British Empire, you find twofold types of experiment. On the one hand, you find a series of examples where a debate in mainstream, if you like, mainstream bourgeois political arenas in the United Kingdom are focused on the productivity of land as a resource. What that means is that very crudely, what emerges is the debates around the land tax movement that comes out through Henry George in the States, but also debates in the United Kingdom about whether land banking is productive for the economy, and experiments in various parts of the empire about how it might be possible to have government hold and power over land, whilst at the same time having alternative arrangements around property rights, producing extraordinary diversity between, if you like, the legacies of Mughal rule in India and the zamindari system, which create a fundamental prerogative line with the state, at the same time allowing property rights to exist on top of a certain state prerogative to generate tax. You have the alternative forms of ownership that sit on top of the zamindari system. In the case of Singapore, post-colonial rule, you have complete nationalization of the land. In the case of Hong Kong, what you have is a kind of example of precisely that British concern about land owning, resulting in a resting of leasehold powers in sitting with the state, but freehold powers sitting with the state, but with the state having a prerogative to open up land to being used on long leaseholds. And what I want to argue kind of very crudely, and the paper goes into this in a little bit more detail, is that the architecture of real markets, historically and geographically, are precisely about how those multiple property rights are pluralized in real worlds, and those kinds of pluralization have consequences for how we think about the translation of issues of race and class into the landscapes of the present day. If you look at the example with which I think we kind of almost need to think through as paradigmatic comparison with the rest of the world, when China modernizes in the post-Deng Xiaoping era, in 1978, the opening up and reform process in part borrows from the Hong Kong leasehold model. So the Shenzhen model of property ownership draws absolutely explicitly from the Hong Kong model of state ownership of freehold with experimental government-controlled leasing of land. It generates a landscape in Shenzhen where effectively you have incredibly rapid change through the 1980s and 1980s. A series of villages, the Chongqing, the villages in the city, grow from being concentrations of about 280,000 people to a city of 18 million people today. They accommodate migrants at a phenomenal rate, but the geopolitics of land holdings and power in the city is actually incredibly important. What you have is small villages which act as de facto real estate companies. The villages own the property using rural property rights under the old Chinese system. Those rural property rights are different in kind to the urban property rights that exist in the rest of the city. And so you create a tension between city governance and the governance of the villages in the city, where at one and the same time, those villages in the city are incentivized to grow rapidly. They accommodate migrants, but the state prerogative over the whole is, if you like, never sacrificed. It's a very kind of crude caricature, but the point I'd want to make is that you can read the forms of informality, the forms of insurgent urbanism that are possible in Shenzhen or in Delhi or in Singapore, in part through this tension between the aspiration to formalize the rational city in the attempts to organize city form through the property rights that are existent. It makes us think differently, I want to argue, about how we come to think about the city commons. And what I mean by that is that if we actually begin to think about what might be possible in the context of the discussions relating to this coach, if we think about how the city might be figured differently, then there's a sense in which I just want to read from a short section of the paper where it might be possible to develop this thinking around property rights in a way which speaks back to some of the easier invocations of the neoliberal. What I want to suggest is that, if you like, migration provides a lens through which the dilemmas of particular moments of mobility speak to the human condition. Characteristically, people arrive in one place more often than not as adults seeking a job, an education, or family ties. They arrive to some degree skilled and schooled. To the extent that they work and participate in labour markets, they contribute to the metropolitan economy, even as their arrival may place strains on the commons of the city. The public resources that we share, the ecology, the neighbourhood, welfare nets strained by new arrivals, the competition for scarce resources of land, housing and shelter. And if you think about the kinds of conflict that we see in cities of the south as arrivals from the countryside struggle to regularise informal property rights in situ, against frequently already marginalised communities living in the less privileged parts of the city. These kinds of tensions, we need to kind of think through that interplay between state prerogative and private interest. It's possible to see this process analytically as the transitional strains of economic development. The long-term return on the mobility of labour optimises factor resource distribution, powers economic growth and drives social change in 19th century London or 21st century Shanghai. But as the city grows, it may undermine its own sustainability through ecological hazards of pollution and traffic, and failures to plan waste and water and the exploitation of scarce public resources. This involves a potential tragedy of the commons as the metropolis spirals into decline. Detroit has become emblematic of such a malaise and post-industrial shrinking. But at times it is also possible to see less the tragedy of the commons than the banality of repertoires of social closure in the face of scarcity. Competition for scarce resources between those who have least structures logics of intolerance. The response, for example, the response of an ageing Europe to a challenged welfare state, paradoxically staffed by the very migrants who are popularly represented as threatening its survival. New urbanisms generate new commons in liminal and restructuring urban spaces, and at the rural-urban interface in Europe and the USA, as well as in the emergent economies of China, economy, Brazil, South Africa. As new arrivals make sense of a city that is not their own, the metropolis mutates, ecologies and publics are reconstituted, and the calculus of economic change is resynchronized. These changes inevitably challenge the legitimacy of rule and governance of already existing common interests. There's a way in which we can turn back economic theory itself, I think, at this point. The legitimacy of the rule and governance already, these changes inevitably challenge the legitimacy of rule and governance of already existing common interests. But which parts of the future metropolis, which spaces and times should be thought of as common pool resources? When and how are private rights challenged by collective needs in the future city? Migration brings such questions to the foreground when mayors and municipal decision makers have to balance the demands of the present and the needs of the future metropolis. This is particularly pronounced in cities where development and expansion is most rapid, in emergent megacities such as Delhi, Shenzhen and Sao Paulo, but also when old metropolises such as Moscow or London reinvent themselves. Optimal economic organisation of the affluent metropolis may sit in tension with the moral calculus of the good city, implying policy trade-offs between what is plausible and what is ideal, and requiring the reconciliation of demographic pressures of settlement with rational organisation of space, property rights, and popular demands for redistribution, formal and informal realities. The economics and political science literature on the commons has focused primarily on the rural context, but revisiting the subject becomes more pressing as the world turns urban. In her landmark work governing the commons, Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom briefly discusses migration as a potential threat to collective understandings of and agreements on use and access to resources. But in her later writing, Ostrom oriented her work towards an analysis of the attributes of community with stable resource pooling, including questions of generational populational shifts and migration. She synthesized the ethical questions and empirical challenges of migration by incorporating both the putative threat of diversity to legitimacy and also the rules of use through questions through which a shifting community and common pool resources should be held. And the point I want to make very simply in the paper is that when we begin to think about the city in terms of a collective identity, when we begin to think, if you like, going back to the language of Harvey, of in whose image the city might be remade, its future as much as its past, when we're thinking of trying to balance those legacies of claims making that rest on the racial injustices of the past with the potential, the propensity of the city to create a future, there's ways in which some of the internal critiques of neoclassical economics that comes out of the notion of the commons begins to reframe the problem of externalities itself. The simple, to kind of cut to the end of the story a little bit, the part of what I want to try to argue a little bit in the kind of remaining 10, 12 minutes is that just as we might think about the historical contingency of the law and economics movements actually structuring a certain kind of economic reason in the late 20th century, precisely because of the disciplinary trumping of jurisprudential theory through the economic calculus, we might also begin to think of ways in which alternative measures of value and worth begin to qualify economic reason, almost by default as much as design in the cities of the 21st century, that have to confront the potentially catastrophic consequences of ecological change, but also the demographic consequences of migration and mobility. Both of these create the challenge of arrival alongside the challenge of in whose image will the city be made. And this becomes a problem as much to the economic calculus as it does to, if you like, the registers of political reason. In her own questions, Elinor Ostrom highlights both analytical and normative challenges of migration for the city. Because migrants join communities that may already be tenure insecure, whether in rural or urban settings, local groups can be quick to abandon or change ways of tenure in the face of significant migrant arrival, because there can be little reason to continue with rules that others are not following. And in a kind of dry economic language, what Ostrom is partly talking to is if you look at what happens in Santiago, where the Chicago boys' logic is turned into the creation of social housing for some, but the exclusion of others in new shanty towns. Or if you look at Cairo, where something like 10 million of the 18 million residents of the city have no tenure security, and there is consequently a set of internal power plays between those who gain access to new real estate development and those who are excluded from it. Or if you look at Turkey, where the formalization of property rights is precisely about, at a particular moment, the triumph of certain regimes of real estate control, but at other moments is about how forms of insurgent urban politics become played out in ways that can be creative and create alternative sorts of city. So the point is that, I mean, in Ostrom's work, the simple analytics of the law and economics movement becomes disrupted by the introduction of the credibility of the rules of the game. If you think back to that point about the ordo-liberals that I was trying to make earlier on, that the clarity of the rules depends in part on the credibility of the rules themselves. The central question of legitimacy for Ostrom, a crucial component of protection against eviction in much of the global south, is complicated as migrant groups may shift, appropriate or alter the premises for access to land-based resources. But the question of legitimacy in the city polis also invokes the ethical obligation to the stranger. In other words, the rights of new arrivals to have rights. It does not isolate the empirical diversity from the contested ethics of the good life, and instead points towards the inevitable mixing of the moral private problems and instrumental public issues. The contemporary city consequently reframes the sense of arrival. Ethically, we arrive in the present as somehow strangers to ourselves. The facility of the modern is the chameleon-like propensity for change so rapid that vernacular knowledges of place are trumped by the transformation of spaces of the everyday in processes of economic restructuring. I think what that means in the context of the interplay of race and class in these contexts is that there's a sense in which what I want to suggest is that we need to think about the politics of urban participation against this register, against this calculus of arrival and rights. The point of the paper, if you like, is to kind of qualify the claims that are being made in some of the kind of rights to the city discourse, which has become so pervasive, not least, when you have the head of UN Habitat, once mayor of Barcelona, famous for the gentrification of Raval and the displacement of people around Raval. We need to think about exactly what is at stake in some of these discussions of urban citizenship. So very straightforwardly, what that means is that I want to give 4 or 5 very quick examples of what this might mean if we tease it out before kind of wrapping up the talk altogether. There is a sense in which there is a politics of community organising that becomes particularly popular certainly in Europe at the moment, that draws its inspiration from Alinsky, that draws its appeal on a sense of community solidarity. It becomes important in thinking about how, just to give one example, the vocabulary of the known city, the vocabulary that depends on family, that depends on neighbourhood and depends on religious faith, becomes a principle of community solidarity and community organising. In the context of London, the challenge of that, though, is that what you see in London is both strong community organising around those known variables, but also a geopolitics of what is happening in Dhaka with Sheikh Hasina's relation to Jamaati Islam, played out in Dhaka and in London simultaneously, which begin to disrupt those simple solidarities of community, precisely because that tension between Jamaat and Awami League in Bangladesh today plays out in echo on the streets of London. So when there are demonstrations in a square in Dhaka, they're replicated in Alta Valley Park, alternately between those two formations. They begin to cut against that sense of, if you like, the metaphysics of presence, in which community organising is sometimes, through which community organising is sometimes articulated. It also means that the kinds of minor politics that the city is incredibly creative in organising, the sorts of alternative worldview that depend on curious connections between forms of innovation and forms of assemblage, the sort of stuff that people like Malik Simone have written about so beautifully, become potentially rendered invisible by certain kinds of language, but made visible through other kinds of narrative. I want to kind of jump to the conclusion, really, just to give myself at least some time to explain a little bit more of what this might mean for a thinking that qualifies where I started from, that sense in which the simple political economies of the city that you find in certain kinds of Marxist register reach what I think are their limits. The argument I want to focus on actually is just a couple of points that are on the slide and the conclusion. There is, in a sense, a way of thinking about the economization of everyday life through the neoliberal in a way which actually casts the expertise of economics against alternative ways of making visible urban space. What I argue in the paper and in some other work that I've done more recently is that there's a sense in which we might understand the logics of that calculus, but also understand its limits. In the work of, particularly the work of Boltanski and Thévenot, there's a way in which we might understand economics itself, not in its Colonian way as being merely performative, but as being a form of disciplinary reason that makes spaces of the city visible through certain kinds of logic. Those logics have their own limits, as I've tried to suggest when we begin to think about the neoclassical theorization of the city as commons. But we might also begin to think of alternative forms of expertise. Tim Mitchell has very beautifully, in the case of Egypt, it's shown in a slightly Colonian fashion, if you like, how when economics is transplanted across the world, it reaches its natural limits through producing a kind of expertise that tries to level out all of those complex histories of alternative property rights claims in Cairo and other parts of the country. Economics begins to overspill itself in Mitchell's work. But what we might think of is instead the ways in which alternative registers of value and worth can be juxtaposed with the economic. The aesthetics of the architectural form alongside the ethical registers of certain kinds of moral settlement of welfare. When we're thinking about the privileging of certain groups in terms of social need or certain groups in terms of historical injustice. When one thinks, again, about informal settlements in the cities across the world, there is inevitably a trade-off between those forms of injustice that are historically and locally derived. If you look at some of the events in Durban recently or other parts of South Africa, and those forms of injustice that are, if you like, based outside place, but are realized in urban form. As people move into the city, the forms of injustice that have caused them to move sit and are contested against the forms of injustice that are historical in place and through forms of dispossession and displacement. It creates, I think, certain kinds of trade-offs. The trade-offs that I just want to highlight are sometimes uncomfortable, not least when we think about the ways in which labour markets work. We know that in terms of the ways in which cities perform, that the anonymity of the city is precisely one of the kind of effective ways in which new arrivals are accommodated into the metropolis. But that also means that there is potentially a tension between the flexibility of labour markets and the reality of migrant rights. It's an uncomfortable tension and potentially an uncomfortable trade-off between the two. We know that the bonds of social solidarity, neighbourhood solidarity, and that sense of the city as a political space through which individual freedoms are asserted, also sit in tension with one another. We know that in terms of some of the ways in which slum upgrading processes work, that there's a simple appeal, an almost natural appeal to resist dispossession and displacement, to enact tenure for those who are the subjects of big programs of city renewal. But ethically, as well as in registers of the economic, that rests in part upon the discrediting of those big tools of social engineering, the planning, the master planning, the state interference that we've seen so much as failures in the past. But when we look to parts of the world where some of those master planning exercises are carried out in different ways, there are alternative possibilities. What I'm trying to argue, I guess, is that we can't merely discard the tools of social engineering of the 20th century quite so easily as we thought in the past. And that sense of might actually make us think about what kinds of combination speak to the cities of the present, in terms of what I've talked about as alternative kinds of combination, combinations of scale, in terms of skill, in terms of scope. The point I'm trying to make is that the creativities of the informal city, alongside the regularities of the formal city, ought to make us think slightly more differently about those easy stories that actually create the subjects of dispossession as invariably heroic, and the levers of state power as being inevitably insidious. There is something that's got to be at stake if we're beginning to think about what the non-racial might mean in the cities of the future. Thank you.